Have you here. We're going to do a slow start because we have less than the anticipated number of people. So Matt and I will just talk very slowly. No. So welcome everyone to the NIATx Virtual Change Leader Academy. This is the fourth and final session of our series, and we'll do a lot of recapping what we've learned. And if the group stays small, we'll do some hands-on support for you all in change projects that you'd like to initiate or create. I think for the next slide, Matt. Just a reminder that funding for this initiative is made possible from SAMHSA, and that the views expressed here today are those of the presenters and not necessarily the views of the Department of Health and Human Services. Also a reminder that the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence offers technical assistance in these 4 core areas, so integrating peer support into different settings, building the capacity of recovery community organizations, coming alongside and helping grow the peer recovery workforce, and then evidence-based toolkits and resources. And always we want to use person-first language in everything that we do. Yes, I'll leave it at that. A little bit of housekeeping. If you're able to, please do come on camera. These are highly interactive sessions. If you feel free to unmute and talk if you have a question, and then always feel free to also add to the chat with questions, thoughts, comments, any of that.
All right, I'm going to share a different file so I can show you a quick video to get us started, because we're going to be talking about data. So there's a fun little video, which is a nice reflection on making sure that you're collecting the right data, that you're interpreting your data that you are collecting properly. So let me just go ahead and find that and pull it up for you. Oops, I just realized something. Made a mistake. Sorry about that. Let me fix that. Oh, what's happening here? Sorry. My apologies, folks. I got multiple files that I didn't escape that one. Sorry about that. Now we'll get it.
You're just following the recommendation that we do a nice slow start, Matt.
That's
right.
right.
So thank you.
Speak very slowly.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go ahead and play this video for you.
Peter, come take a look at this.
Mr. Daniels.
Mr. Daniels.
Look at this. What's this?
The numbers, they keep getting bigger and bigger.
The clicks are off the charts.
Yeah.
Yoshi, it's Walter. We're back.
Yes, sir.
I need more trees. More trees? I'll get you more trees.
Hey, take a look at Woodpole.
Whoa. Everything you got on Woodpole right now.
He really loves that thing.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? Some of the risks related to data when you're perhaps not measuring what you thought you were measuring. I just want to start by asking you all a question while we get rolling around data. When I say we have to measure, let's think about doing a change and let's figure out how we're going to measure it. What kinds of thoughts, feelings, reactions do you have to that idea of figuring out what the data is? What's your, not necessarily do I want you to tell me your data plan, but I just want you to tell me how you feel when we start to talk about figuring out how to measure these things. What sorts of reactions do you have? Does it create a motivation to go do something? Does it create some anxiety? Does it create some confusion or concern? Well, what sort of reactions when you know that today we're talking about data? How does it feel?
So my initial reaction is my initial reaction.
Right. Yes.
However, I have come to have a appreciation for data and for finding it. I still am resistant, but I am gaining an appreciation.
Yeah. I think, Chris, that's a common experience. What the path you just described, that sequence that you just described, where a lot of us come to the work from a felt sense of mission, very personal connectedness to the work. And then when folks talk about data, initially that just feels like it's very detached and not really connected to my felt sense of mission and purpose, and like, that's kind of somebody else's thing. That's not my thing. But somehow you've been finding a way to make it your thing. I'm curious how you've been doing that. I asked that to you, Chris, but I also ask it to everybody. How do you make the data stuff your thing?
I think when it comes down to it, you want to be efficient, and so I think it starts with efficiency, but then it sort of transcends into other areas. It's efficiency, but also then when you get down to the finer details, like making sure that it's not only that it's efficient, but that it's reaching targeted areas, right? And then efficient, reaching targeted areas, and then also, keeping it productive.
Yeah.
How all of that sort of comes together.
Yeah, I think this, you really well said, the idea of being productive. I was just imagining while you were talking, I was watching some films of the wildfires, that people are struggling with out in Arizona. And imagine if you had a firefighter who was operating one of those helicopters that's dropping water on fire. And imagine that they weren't looking at the fire below and didn't have the data and the information they needed to drop it in the right spots. And at the end of the day, they said, awesome, super productive day. I worked so hard. I got so much done. I dropped 60 loads of water. And then someone said to them, yeah, but you didn't drop them on the fire. You dropped them, I'm not sure where, dropped them into another pond or something. You dropped them where we didn't need it. Because your point is so critical. It's like we do this work because we want to help people. We do this because we want to reach people who don't have certain supports that they need in order to achieve their goals, in order to work on their recovery, in order to move forward. We do this so that people can have opportunities that they might not have had otherwise, and they can help us and we can help them. So that efficiency factor you're talking about, and the only way we know any of that is through some data. We have to have some data that helps us to know, is what we're doing helping? And that's where we kind of pull the data together with our mission. And then it's how we steer. We need to be able to, it's like having lights on our car at night. We can't get anywhere unless we have lights. We need to be able to see where we're going and to do this mission. So thank you for that, Chris. Anybody else have any thoughts in terms of how you respond to data conversations? I think you were a really good representative position, Chris, because what you described is just such a common experience. That kind of that path that you described. So you described it really effectively. So I thank you for that. So I'm going to pull up our slides to start talking about some data stuff. So if we start with that idea, we talked about the encyclopedia commercial and, are you collecting the right data, right? So if the firefighter's not dropping the water on the right spots, then clearly they're not collecting the right data and maybe not being responsive to the data that is being collected. So we want to think together with you today about what kinds of data you need to collect, and we'll hopefully have some conversations about this and have it really feel meaningful and purposeful to you and to the work that you're trying to do. So when we're doing these change projects, of course, we always need to be finding a way to measure, because the PDSA cycle is dependent upon that measurement in order to be able to move forward. So we have this checklist that we use, 5 elements that we like to think about related to data, which we can talk about, and maybe we'll sort of ask you your thoughts on each of these elements as we share them. So the first one is to have clearly defined measures. What is it that we're trying to measure? This is often more challenging than we think. Seems pretty simple and intuitive, like, okay, we're going to do something and we're going to measure it. There are a lot of things that we can't measure directly, right? Like recovery. You can't put a yardstick on recovery. You don't have units of recovery to measure. So we have to look for indicators of recovery, right? What is something that's an indication that people are moving in a direction that is achievement of their personal recovery goals? And again, personal recovery goals. So we can't even have a generic measure of recovery. And then we get to this issue that everybody has their own definition of what that means and what their progress looks like for them, what they prioritize in their progress. So finding indicators we need to take some time to think about how we know whether or not the supports that we're delivering are helpful. And some of you have maybe had this conversation with others or with yourself where you've said, we're doing this work, we're providing these supports. Is it helpful? And how do we know it's helpful? So what's the measure that we can use to know that it's helpful? Does anyone have a thought when I say that? When I say, how do you know it's helpful? What comes to mind in terms of ways that you know? How do you know? And I have no doubt that it is helpful. So this is not me questioning whether or not what you're doing is helpful. I know it is. But how do you answer that question if someone were to say to you, let's say someone who's totally ignorant of what you do, and you tell them what you do, and then they say, well, how do you know that it's helping? And what do you say?
That doesn't have to do how you've been that comes to collecting your data.
Mm-hmm.
That you're seeing, is making a difference in the data that you're collecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I see a difference in the data, and I ask to you, Juan, or to anyone else who wants to add a reflection. Thank you for that. What's the data that I'm collecting that tells me that it is helpful, that it does make a difference? What is there currently that you know that's a measure, that's some kind of an indicator that shows that the work is having an impact? Does anyone have a?
In the progress, like for me, I supervise recovery coaches. I have a tool where I collect data on the monthly basis in making the progress. So, I can see when they when I collecting and I'm reading it and I'm looking at if I'm making any progress or something is, is not right, do that.
Yeah. So that the progress, and you're measuring it, you're seeing the progress, and how do you count that progress? How do you measure it? What's the count for progress?
As they reporting it and they share.
Okay, so it's them doing a report of specific things that are happening. So there's sort of a checklist, like they did this, they did this, they did this. So there are certain common elements that you probably use as indicators. Did the person successfully complete this step or this process? Did the person successfully complete that process? And some of those might be common to most of the people you work with, certain things.
Yes, and also, beside the check-in, some questions like, what you would like to see different, what you would like to see new, something that you've seen that is not working. Because that's how I'm going to know. I can see on my way, but if the front line, the people in the front line, they know what is happening.
Yeah. So people defining their own personal recovery goals and then the achievement of those goals as an indication of progress. That's an excellent way to measure someone's personal progress. It can become a little tricky when we're trying to measure progress as a whole program, because each individual person has their own recovery goals. Some might be a little easier to achieve. Some might be very difficult to achieve. They'll be all different. And so it's difficult for us to say 27% of recovery goals were accomplished, because some of them are big and some of them are little. So the comparison can be really challenging. And I think completion of goals is one good indicator for sure.
Always ask what you like, what you don't like. So and discussing that with them.
Yeah.
So they know that you're paying attention. What, that you're aware and you want to make it different.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about other people? Thank you for that, Juan. Does anyone else have a thought on if someone were to ask you, how do you know that what you're doing is having an impact? How do you measure it? Does anyone have a thought on how they answer that question?
It's a hard question to answer. I'm always pretty bold when I say things. I say, well, do you want the list alphabetical? Because it's hard to say unless you're doing the process itself. I mean, it can be something as simple as I know it works because I've seen the result in their recovery. I see the results in them not having to ask me for resources. So it's more something like that rather than a black and white on paper charting kind of thing. It's more of a personal feeling you have when you know the process is working. If I set a goal for somebody, that you'll come for therapy, every 2 weeks, and they, miss one out of 3 months. Yeah, you can put it on a chart.
Yeah.
And see it, but by working with them, that it actually was working. When you'd say something like that to them, let's try to do every 2 weeks, for the next 3 months. Versus, just saying, why don't you come to therapy? Try to, make it to all your appointments. So like you said, it's on where you put the goal. Is it a doable goal? Is it too high? It might be too blank for them to achieve it if you say, let's try to get you to therapy, to all your scheduled therapies. And that's too open-ended. It leads them to making errors, to not achieving it, because you didn't give them anything concrete, versus let's for the next 3 months come every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It gives them more of a focus.
Yeah. So this is what you're saying, Judy, is really important, because it is so personal. Recovery is so personal, and the supports are so personal. When we start to think about finding a way to measure it, as you were just describing, and I'm going to ask Chris if she would kind of weigh in on this a little bit too, because we've had conversations about this before, the idea of saying, well, I know it because I can feel it, which is absolutely true. And I know it because I'm experiencing it, which is absolutely true. And then let's say you're talking to someone who's somewhat cynical. Well, that's just you feeling things and thinking things. I need some harder data on this, but I can't put data or yardstick on the recovery. The person's experiencing it with me. But then we say, well, are there indications that show that we can measure? And I was wondering what Chris was thinking, because this is such a personal business. How do we think about that business of measuring it?
Were you asking me or the other Chris?
Yeah, you, Chris Kelly. Sorry, I'm
okay,
sorry.
No, it's okay. I just didn't want to
I forgot. We got two Chris's, both that start with a K too, so I can't say Chris with a K either.
Well, I mean, there are, in the especially peer services field, we do have the recovery capital scale and index, which provides us that data of someone's growth in recovery capital. And so I think that's important to not overlook. And then because the addictions field tends to be so binary and really only measure recovery based on use or abstinence, so it's very black and white. We could certainly, I look to the public health field and social determinants of health and quality of life indicators and bring those into like peer run organizations or peer support programs as a way. Again, I think there's measurement tools out there, but we have to look outside our field often for those, because that's how we would accurately show data on, quality of life improvement. And then there's the kind of 10,000 foot view data of simple things like reduced use of emergency or crisis services, or reduced hospital stays, or reduced interactions with law enforcement. And it's a lot of it is reduction in those consequences that might have brought them to your door, and then improvements in quality of life and recovery capital.
Yeah, all those quality of life things like stable housing or relationships, or interactions, certain with family or other relationships. So all these things are all countable things. Everything you just described, we could put a yardstick to any one of those individually. Collectively, they give us a portrait, right? A portrait of someone's life being enhanced as a result of the supports that they're receiving. And then we can count all these individual things. This person last year was arrested 5 times. And then they started an engagement with this program, which included some peer recovery support. And they've only been arrested 1 time this year. That's a huge change, right? So we measured that, and we can show the massive improvement, and we can say that the program helped that. So that's us measuring recovery. In the vague, sense, it's a part. That's not the only thing that indicates recovery progress. It's one thing, and then there are several other things. So yeah, those different social determinants, those different factors that we can count, things that we can count that show progress. So it can become a little challenging to just come up with one thing to count. There might be more than one thing. For the purposes of our change project and this Change Leader Academy and learning how to use this model, we usually come up with one measurement. So And it might be attendance. I think Judy was making mention of people participating. That's an indicator of a certain kind of progress because maybe they've started programs before but have struggled to continue with them. And now they're starting this program and we're offering additional supports, peer supports to help them to stay connected. And now they are continuing with their program. So this is clearly something that we could count. So there are a lot of different ways to think about counting, but we have to come up with that measure. So how are we going to count stuff? What is going to be our measure to indicate that our change project is helping? And if what we're trying to do is keep people engaged with services, then maybe attending those services would be a good thing to measure. It depends on what we're trying to achieve, but we have to pick a measure for ourselves. So once we've picked a measure, then we have to think about the baseline. As you recall, we talked about this a little bit before when we were thinking about aim statements. When we want to increase A from B to C by date D, the B is the baseline, right? So we have a certain something we're trying to measure. How is it before we started our change project? What's the number? And then we do our change project and then measure it again and see if it has improved. So we need to try to get some data for us to know how things are going. And so when you think about the kinds of things that you're trying to improve, and then you come up with a measurement, are you able to measure it before you do your change so that you can have a baseline to know how you're doing right now? Then we'll introduce a change and see if we can make it improve. So hopefully that makes sense for folks. Sometimes people forget to do the baseline thing. They just kind of launch right into the change. And that's not a terrible crisis or anything. It happens a lot. It's okay. You can still see the improvement. And sometimes you can go back and get the baseline later, right? We're starting this change project. It seems to be working because people seem to be attending services more. Are they attending more than they used to? I don't know, but I can go back and check that. I can go find out. I can go back and get my baseline. There are some things where you can't necessarily go back and get the baseline, but with most things you can find it. But that's important because when we say it's improving, the only way we know it's improving is if we have a measure at the beginning and then a measure of progress from that point, so that we can compare those 2 points. Pretty clear and simple from a data perspective, and it is sometimes something that folks forget to do, is to measure from the beginning. So any thoughts or questions about that? Also, don't be paralyzed by trying to get too much data. Sometimes folks feel like they have to get all this complicated data at the beginning before they start their project. Just something simple, just count how it was going before you started, and then count how it's going after you start. Just to try to keep it as simple as you can. And just pick maybe one of the indicators that you think might be most the best reflection of your efforts. Is anyone thinking about anything right now that they're a measure that they're trying to use or that they think is important to your services? I'm curious. Like, as we're having this conversation, what's coming up in your mind about a number that maybe drives how you think about your success? Does anyone have a number in mind? Be curious to hear what it is. When you answer that question, this is helpful. I can tell you it's helpful because it goes from X to Y. We've seen an improvement in this, or more people are achieving something. Keep thinking about those metrics and ideas as we talk. And feel free to share them if they come up. Okay, so we do our baseline here, and it's a picture of our baseline here, and we get a number at our baseline. And then we want to establish a goal. So that's number 3 in this list. Coming up with this idea of a goal that we want to achieve. And I think we mentioned this idea of a stretch goal, coming up with a goal that seems like it's a challenge, but also seems doable. We don't want a goal that's super easy. We also don't want a goal that's super difficult and probably impossible. We want one that's kind of in the middle, that seems like it's a challenge, but it seems like maybe we can do it. And if you're doing this as a team, it's nice to have a goal level where some of the team thinks it's doable and the other members of the team think it's not doable. That's probably about the right level of tension. And by tension, I mean positive tension, like a rubber band that's got a little bit of stretch to it. Positive tension so that it has energy, that it can do something, right? If it's slack, that rubber band can't do anything. But if it's too stretched, it's going to break, right? So that in between tension is constructive and useful. That's what we want for a goal. So to think about what would be a good goal for you with your measure. Sometimes folks get sort of stuck on that. I just encourage people to remember that it's not so critical what the goal number is. It's more critical that you have a goal, kind of like with exercise. If you're trying to do certain exercises and you say, well, I think I can do 10 of those. It's not so critical that you do 10 of them. Just come up with a goal, and maybe you do 8, maybe you do 11. But the goal of 10 got you motivated to try to do whatever the exercise is, and that's good, right? So it kind of helped you to feel motivated. So we want the goal to be motivational. We don't want it to feel oppressive or demoralizing or demotivating. We want it to be encouraging you. So that's also part of thinking about what the goal level should be. So then we go back to our chart. We'll think about a goal level. How high do we think we can get with this? Well, let's come up with a goal for ourselves. And then we want to consistently be collecting our data. It can be really helpful to have someone in your team be dedicated as the data coordinator. That's sort of an additional role that sometimes is useful. Who's the person collecting the data? Where is the data going to be stored? How are we going to measure it? And which relates to this fifth idea, which is, how do we chart our progress? How do we keep track? Can we come up with a way to have a simple visual representation of the data? I'm curious. I'll stop sharing for a minute and ask you a question. When you all are talking about how things are going within your program, does anyone ever visually share data? Do you share it, or do other members of your team or your organization share data in a way that allows people to look at it together? I'm curious if anybody has that experience as part of your work. Is it a data desert out there? I bet some of you talk about data, any kind of data. There must be something. I'm curious if someone could share an example of something that gets talked about. Some numbers get talked about. I know that that's true. So what numbers do you talk about?
Well, we do like a weekly newsletter, and with our CRM, like it tracks, so we can see like who opens and who reads and who clicks through. And so it's good and it's interesting, and I think it helps to see like where our information, where it's going and where, how people are reading it and clicking through. Also, what time, I think recently changed the time of when it goes out, and that made an improvement.
So this is a classic PDSA cycle model that you're employing with this data, because you are experimenting. For example, when do we send out the message, and how many people open it? When do they click on it? If we do it at one time during the week or during the day, we get this many, and then we switch it to another and we get a higher percentage. It's a classic plan, do, study, act, really quick, rapid cycle change where you got good data. And so tell us what happened when you changed your time. Which was the better time?
Well, I think Joanna, it was 7. Was it 7 or 8? 8 a.m. Yeah.
8 a.m. Okay. So 8 a.m. resulted in more people reading because it's getting into their inbox as they start the day, and it's at the top of their inbox, because you know that if you put it out in the afternoon, they won't get to it, and then it'll be lower in their inbox. It'll be 15 or 20 down instead of at the top. So you're planning the timing to get it to the top of the box where they first will open it up. And a lot of people do a few emails as they get started, right? They kind of check in and see what's going on, so they'll look at that top thing. Great. And that would be a good hypothesis, and you tested it and you were right, it works. It's an excellent PDSA, very data-driven orientation. So great example. Thanks for that. So what else? Is there another conversation that any of you have been having related to some data, other things that are being counted that you're talking about, other numbers that are coming up in your meetings? Or other numbers that you think about, that you want to know?
We also use numbers of a sort to, like, because we work on projects, so we use numbers of a sort to, like, figure out how close we are to done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, also we revisit at each stage. We revisit, like, well, what does done look like?
Mm-hmm.
And then make adjustments as needed, because so much of what we do we do training and writing.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, you know, like, what we think something's going to look like at the beginning of a project may not be what it actually looks like at the end of the project.
Yeah. So that's interesting, because it's evolving. So it's not like you have a clear target that you're aiming toward. You have a general direction, right? But you don't have a specific target. It evolves as you go. You know, it's likely to be heading east and not west, so you're moving it east, but you don't know the exact address where you'll end up. Yeah. So then you use your data as you're going forward accordingly. You're not driving toward a specific address, but you're generally saying, are we heading east? Are we heading in the general right direction, which we know is the territory? So we have to use our data, our compass, to keep moving this project forward in that direction. So as we get to certain points, and the question you were asking is a good one. I forgot how you phrased it. You know, how do we know when it's done? You know,
what does done look like?
What does done look like? Yeah, that was way better. That was way better. I like the way you said it.
I got it from Brene Brown.
Oh yeah, Brene Brown. Yeah. Yes, I'm familiar with her. My wife is a wicked fan, and she periodically plays me videos from her. They're really good. So yeah, what does done look like? Yeah. So there's some data involved in sort of figuring out what that is. Yeah. So these are good examples that you all are sharing, because sometimes we say, oh, data, well, I'm not really data driven. That's not really my thing, but you are. It's all around you and you're using it. You don't even realize you're using it. You're getting data inputs, you're analyzing them, and you're making adjustments. You're all engaged in sort of PDSA-like activities all the time, because you're constantly adjusting as you go based upon a data response, because you're getting inputs of various kinds, you're analyzing them, and you're making adjustments in what you're doing as you move forward. So that's a good example of it. So charting your progress. I really strongly recommend that you use some simple visual representations of your data. It's always helpful for people to see a simple chart, a nice bar graph or line graph that shows how the data is moving across time. It's a great way to engage your team, to engage any stakeholder, any people who you want to talk to about the work. How do we give them some clear information, but visually represented rather than a table of numbers, right? Tables of numbers don't tend to be storytellers, but lines and bars across time where we can see them move, those are storytellers, and those are very interesting. Those are engaging to folks. So come up with a visual representation. I usually encourage that you keep track of your data for whatever the key indicators are, and that you share it with your team very regularly. You know, whenever you meet, let's look at the picture. Let's look at the story of this graph and see where it's going. Is it up? Is it down? Is it the same? And what does that mean to us? We can have a conversation about that. So I strongly recommend and encourage some visual. Does anyone have examples of any kinds of visuals that are used in your environment? Does anyone have a way of looking at any data with your team? I always like to hear examples of how that is used in practice. Are there things that you look at that you visually share with your group? Things that are countable that kind of can get represented and shared? What do you do? I can't tell if no one's answering because they are not sure they like their data example, or if they're hesitant because they're not sure it's what I'm looking for. I guarantee whatever it is you're thinking of is exactly what I'm looking for, because it's a very loose basket a very big basket that I'm putting out there. So maybe just an example from your experience. What do you share? What do you look at? Does your team, when you sit down together, ever look at any kind of numbers?
So I can tell you what we do. We use several different methods because we just haven't found the one that's like, yes, this is it for us. And it also depends on the project that we're working on, right? So we use Asana, which is a project management platform, so we can see like these are all the steps that have to be taken. And it has like check marks so we can see what the process is. We use Microsoft Planner for like developing ideas. So if we're like writing, for example, we're writing a project right now with a couple of other people. And one of the things that we're doing is we're putting out, like we've created this whiteboard through Microsoft Planner that says, these are the things that we think we want. And then Chris goes and does like, yeah, this is what this is what it would look like if we do this. And then I'll come back and be like, nah, yes, this either, nah, we're kind of missing the mark because like this information is actually leading us in a different direction, or what do we need to pull out? So I'll do like the editing piece and we'll be able to see all of that process. And then we can move, like if this, like, let's say we've got 3 things that we think belong in the same bucket, but the research proves out that that's not true, then we can move things from one bucket to the next bucket and then just take all of that research. So we don't lose everything. We're able to see it. So we do that. And then the other thing that we do is I'm a big I write on walls and windows. So, like in my office, this is my home, but in my office, there are some massive wall-sized windows. And I'll just write out, like, these are the things that I would like us to be able to do for the year. And I bring the team in and I'm like, okay, well, we've got all of these things. And then we start accumulating. So like, we'll pick one window for one goal, and then we'll start accumulating stuff in a box that belongs to that window, and we stick it there, and then we pull it off when we're ready, and we just start taking things apart.
So those are some cool planning practices. So you're using like dry erase markers on the windows. Yeah, because windows work wonderfully as dry erase boards, depending on what's behind them, and if you can see what you write on there. So it sounds like you have a spot where it works out so that you can see it nicely. That's cool. Yeah, that's really cool to use kind of your natural environment and to be able to gather up information and share it and document it and show it to folks. So yeah, those are great. Those are really cool. Thanks for sharing those, Joanna. Yeah, so any kind of visual representation of the focus, the data, we're talking about data mostly as sort of in the numeric sense here with these examples that I'm sharing, but as Johanna's example, the different ways of gathering up information and visually representing it to the team, which allows you to dialogue, right? Allows you to share and interact with each other. If the data is not shared in a way that is accessible to everyone, then you lose the benefit of the team process. We want to make sure it's something that everyone can participate with. So those are the those five recommended areas or five recommendations for measuring: defining the measures clearly, collecting a good baseline, figuring out a nice clear goal, and then consistently collecting data across time and charting it, making a clear visual representation of the data. So if we look at that, back to our nice chart here, this kind of charting is what I highly recommend as you figure out what you're measuring. We figure out our baseline, and then we measure the baseline, then we come up with a good goal, then we start our change project. If we used the example of figuring out when is the best time to send messages to increase the likelihood that people will read them, will open them quickly, we might say, well, the first thing we want to do is to try to do this at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were doing it at the end of the day. So let's move it to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And we see that when we did that, it increased the number of people who read our emails somewhat. It did not help us to reach our goal, however. So then we might decide, it's an upward trend, we're doing pretty well. What should we do now? Should we keep going? Let's say we're going to do that PDSA, so we're going to abandon, adapt, or adopt this. I don't think we're going to abandon it. It seemed to work. I don't know if it's fully there, so we might not adopt this. How about we adapt it? Let's adjust this. We're going to do another cycle of change here. We're going to switch it to 8 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, I'm stealing this example from the thoughtful participants who did this. Let's do it at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then we find, yes, 8 o'clock is the perfect time, because then, as we hypothesized, we're at the top of the inbox, and so we got more reads, immediate reads of the emails, and so now we're going to sustain this because this works really well for us. This gets us where we need to be in terms of that higher rate of people reading. And if people read our information, that helps us to achieve our mission. They're more engaged with us, and our message is getting out there the way we need it to get out there. So that is the data-driven model of PDSA. As you think about it and look at this, you'll see that the PDSA is absolutely driven by the data. So what we want to do now is to take a pause for a minute and ask if you all have any questions about what I've been sharing here as you think about the kinds of things that you're trying to do and the kinds of projects. I think we can talk now about data, but we can also talk more openly and generally because we've had these conversations across the last 4 weeks. So data stuff is certainly relevant, but there also may be other questions or thoughts you may have about using this model. Questions about next steps for you and for how to apply these ideas that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. So what are people thinking? What are you thinking about kind of the next steps for you? What do you think your next step with this material should be? And I like to ask the question, what's your next step? Because the more you are able to articulate a next step, the more likely you are that you will do a next step and pursue something with this stuff. So what are you thinking about as a next step for you related to this PDSA model that we've been exploring?
Well, I know one thing that we're trying to figure out and get some numbers to is, for this current job, how long it takes us to write and put together, modules. And so that we can, again, get to efficiency and, be productive. And so that's something I'm kind of like thinking of too, is like, I guess we don't really have like a baseline, or we can sort of guess at one, but then have a goal of where we want to be, and then work to get to that goal. And the goal would be obviously a finished product, that, and figuring out the man hours that go into that and sort of the process. We have the process sort of flow charted. We just have to figure out like the time that it all takes to get from one process to the next.
Yeah. The work that you're describing, Chris, is very close to the roots of the NIATx model, because as you recall, when we met in the first session, we were talking about the roots in manufacturing and industry. So you're talking about the building of stuff, the manufacturing of things, a module, a written material, some sort of a product. And so to think about the timeline of each part of the assembly process, each stage, each part of that sequence of the building of that product, and how long does it take, and what are the steps and the sub steps, and if we kind of create that flow chart of that assembly line of how we work our way through to the creation final completed product, and then we can put a stopwatch on those. Oh, this part seems to be the part where it slows down. It moves through steps 1, 2, 3 really quickly, but in 4 it gets really slow. Is that by design? Is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? Is there a reason why it's slowing down that's sort of artificial? Like, well, it just slows down because we only get access to the person who can move it along once a week instead of every day, so it sits there for a week. There's a whole bunch of reasons why, but you're doing something that's very much aligned with that original model of manufacturing. So I like the way you talk about it, because you talk about it from an assembly line orientation. I can see you kind of visualizing the sequence and thinking about the resources, the time in each of those sub parts of the process. So
yeah, which I think will like help with scheduling, like all those things. Like there's all these offshoots that kind of go along with that whole process, and if we have that data, then we know, like, okay, going into it 4 days into this project, like this is going to need to take place, yeah. And so we have, sort of this roadmap of how to get from point A to point B and what all it entails. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be fair, like watching it, like I'm like sitting there going, as we've been going through it, I'm like, yeah, I'm the bottleneck.
Right. Yeah. And being the bottleneck, we shouldn't judge it. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing.
Yeah.
It's just what is. And so really then as a team, how do we, because a lot of times the bottleneck is in this kind of work, it's a person. Because we're not, it's not usually the machine, because our computers don't, slow down dramatically from one day to the next or anything like that. So it's usually about workloads and, the capacity of an individual to do a certain task at a certain time, right? So if we think about it from that manufacturing perspective, there are certain elements of the assembly line that require 1 worker, and there are other elements that require 10 workers because they are much more time consuming or labor intensive. And so in order to keep the assembly line moving at the same speed, if you keep that variable consistent, you need 2 workers here, you need 6 workers here, you need 12 workers here, right? Because this is a much more labor intensive process. So for you all to kind of borrow that thinking, which is, okay, where do we have log jams? Is there a way for us to reconfigure our resources in a way that makes us more efficient? Or do we have to keep the assembly line going? Can this one stop and that one start? And can we be working on, you juggle this all the time anyway, right? We're doing 3 things at once or more, or 6 or 7 things at once. And so, when can they sit? And if they sit, does that make them at risk? Does that make them less, does that decrease our efficiency if they sit, or is it okay? Some things you can put on ice and then take them off, take them back out, and you just start right back up again. Other things you put on ice and then you take them back out, and it's like, what was this? Where were we? What were we doing? We got to start over because it didn't freeze well, right? Some things freeze well, other things not so much. So you all are learning that, right? You're doing all these experiments. So these are all great examples. So thank you for that. What about other people? What are you thinking in terms of next steps based upon the stuff that we've been talking about? What do you think would be a next place to go as it relates to this PDSA work and things that might be right for you?
I can share one, Matt, that
sure.
where all of you are unbeknownst or unknowingly a part of right now. So we're trying to maintain or increase our retention rates in the Change Leader Academies we offer. And I'm just using this for an example because I think you could apply it to like a lot of group work and different things you do, or if you're doing education within your organization, kind of things we've thought about. So we did our first 2 CLAs were the baseline, and we tracked the data, which was purely attendance. And then the third, I'm going back to last year too, Matt. So the third CLA we did, what did we shift? So, or for this one, we shifted to sending out direct calendar invites versus something someone had to download, like just sending out the calendar invite as if everyone was attending, and then increase the frequency of the reminder emails. And so now after this session, I'll measure and get the rate of retention, which has gone down for this one as well, compare it to the first 2 I measured, and then with my team develop a different set of interventions or different ways that we could conduct this training that might increase that retention.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Those are great examples, right? Simple, clear measure, try something, try an experiment. We're repeating the process multiple times. So each time we can make an adjustment and see what we get. And you can learn a lot by doing this across time. We get a lot of knowledge from each of those efforts. And of course, you just have to have conversations, and then you have to sort of sort through what that means for you. So what are you changing? Just like when Chris and Joanna were saying, well, we're sending the emails out at 8 o'clock. So Chris and I could be saying, well, we're going to do these sorts of invites because those seem to work a little better than the other kind. So it's going to drive that decision, and then we can feel pretty confident that we're doing something that works better because we've done the experiment, we've tried it, we've experimented, and we've got some data. So that's a nice confident place that leaves you in as you move forward. You don't feel like you're guessing, because some of our work we end up feeling like we're guessing, like, oh, is this going to help? I don't know, let's try it. Here we're running these experiments, and then we can be pretty comfortable. We know that this works better than that because we tested it. So that helps us to know that we're using our resources wisely, which is also a really important thing to be able to share with funders, with anyone who is tracking your productivity or is wanting to know what you're doing with your resources, to share your improvement projects and the data related to it. is a super good way to maintain or increase your funding, because that's proving to the funder that you are a good steward of the dollars that have been given to you to do your mission. Sometimes with certain kinds of services, the stewardship question is a little bit fuzzy, because folks will say, well, you can't put a number on this. We're saving people's lives. We're making a difference. Just believe that what we're doing is really valuable and keep supporting it. Now, I don't disagree with that position, but in hard economic times, it's pretty difficult if that's the only reply you have when people ask you to talk about the productivity, the results from your services that you provide. So this PDSA model allows you an opportunity to be more data driven about it and to say, yeah, here's what we did and here's how it worked. So easier for them to support you when you do that. So, any other thoughts now about what you'll be doing? Any thoughts related to next steps? I'm going to share a couple more slides here. But I just want to also give anybody else a chance who had a thought about what their next step might be if you wanted to share it. We always encourage everyone to check out the NIATx website, www.niatex.net, which is a great place to get lots of information about this NIATx model, about PDSA change. You'll see on the website that you can sort the contents. You can look at the different tools that we've been talking about. You can download and gather information about using those tools and a bunch of other different resources. You can learn more about some of the history and the nature of NIATx that we've been talking about here as well. You can also look at projects that people have completed. There's a pretty extensive inventory of change projects that have been documented that you can read through. And that's a really nice way to learn more about the model, to get ideas. So here's a simple screenshot of the different kind of variables that you can see there. You can see that there are different levels of care. Now, we don't have a volume of stories from our peer recovery services. I do think that a lot of the stories that you'll see are very relevant to peer support, even though they might take place in a different environment. And some of the stories might reflect the inclusion of some peer supports in those stories. For example, in a clinic environment where they're using peer support as an additional support to whatever else they're doing. So check it out. I really encourage you to just look at it and kind of browse through some of the resources that you'll see there. That is the wrap up of our content for today. I see we do have the QR code here, Chris. This is the current QR code that we'll have for folks to use.
Yes.
Okay, great. Good. So before we get to that, you can. We certainly encourage you to do the evaluation for us, and that's the QR code. If you want to, just grab that. Of course, if you have a QR reader on your phone, you can just do the evaluation for us by just grabbing that code and completing it. Those are really important. We really appreciate you doing it. Chris, do you have other thoughts or items that we want to chat with folks about?
Well, I keep going back to, and we do have some time if anybody wants to kind of pitch something that you've been chewing on, like meaning, here's the program that I work within, here's what I want to see happen, what could I potentially do? So feel free to utilize this time for those purposes too. But I say just try something. The first couple times I used this process, it felt awkward and maybe clunky. And then it got easier, and I started to see the potential of using this change process more frequently and applying it kind of to anything, and it's up to you, like how deep you go with it. Like I said, like for this Change Leader Academy, I don't have a whole change team working with me, but I'm applying these principles, and then I can go back to my manager, my leader, and say, hey, look, here's what I've been doing. Could you help me out? And it's much easier for him to help me when he sees the data of what I've been working with. Like, here's data from session 1, session 2, here's the changes I tried, here's session 3. We're going to do session 4. Could you help me brainstorm some ideas? And because we do it as a team frequently, the language I use is really familiar to him. Like he's very tuned into that and has ideas for me. So my big thing is just try it. Like if it interests you and you want to dip your toes, just dip your toes, use a piece, use the whole thing on something simple.
Yeah, and you raise a good point, Chris. This is a team-based model, as is clear from the way we talk about it. And you can do it as an individual activity, like what Chris was just describing. You can experiment with a PDSA with something that you can do on your own. I think I always encourage team activity because I just think teams are so valuable and so strong and important in terms of gaining a diverse range of experiences and knowledge that you get when you have a team process. So I always encourage folks to do any change from a team perspective. But that said, there are plenty of experiments that you can do with one person, 2 people, or you can just have a chat and say, hey, why don't we try this and let's measure it and let's see. And you can use these tools and let's kind of walk through it. Let's see what the experience is like. Let's try to map it out with this flow chart. Let's try to brainstorm and see how we could fix this challenge that we saw when we flow charted it. And let's try to then PDSA that thing. And yeah, it can be very informal and flexible, and you can use it in whatever ways work for you. So I also I'm going to put my email in the chat. So I'm always curious to have people contact me and let me know what they're doing or how they're using these tools. That's really valuable to me to know what folks are doing. And if you have a question or a concern that I can help with as you're doing the work, then just shoot me an email. I'm always happy to talk to folks about this, particularly as it relates to anything that you get stuck with as you're trying to use these tools. I always say, don't get stuck when you've got plenty of resources around, folks who can help you to kind of move it forward. So please feel free to ask. I'm always happy to talk about these things. And so we've hopefully had folks get a chance to pull that QR code.
We will send it out afterwards in an email as well.
Excellent.
So this is not your only opportunity.
Good. So with that, I will say thank you and certainly give folks a opportunity if there are any final thoughts or comments or questions before we wind down for today.
I just want to say thank you for taking the time to be with us these last couple of Tuesdays. I definitely have learned a lot. Like I said earlier, my appreciation for data has definitely gone up. So, and I look forward to, implementing some of these. I know Joanna is too. And so I think it'll make a big difference in how we work as a team. So,
excellent.
So I'm leaving with excitement.
Good. Love to hear it. That's great. Yeah, just try a tool and see where it takes you. So yeah, that's really good. I appreciate that. I did appreciate, Chris, how you told that story today of your reflection, because I thought it was very representative of how so many people experience this work. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Great training. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. Good to have you with us. So any other questions or thoughts as we wind down for today?
Chris, thank you.
The barcode in there again so I can, for the evaluation.
Oh, the QR code. Chris, you said you'll be emailing those out to everybody, right?
Yeah, Juan, I'll be sending an email out probably just even later this afternoon or tomorrow morning so that you can do it on your laptop, if that works for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate all the support. Cindy, thanks for your support of managing, et cetera, to make sure we get all of our technical elements in place. So thank you for that. And thank you all. Chris, as always, good to partner with you in doing the work.
Absolutely, Matt. You have a, as you'd say, wicked knack for making this stuff fun. So I really appreciate that.
All right, for sure. Thank you all. All right, it's been great talking with you, and we'll hopefully talk again soon. Okay.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you, Judy.